The White Tree of Gondor. It's more than just a tree. Isildur was voted as the AGQ Man of the Year for saving it, and it is a real relic of the past, and that is today's topic, so I hope you enjoy. Hello, this is Gone with Gandalf, and you join me here for another lore video. And if you'd like to see more of these, make sure that you like it and subscribe, because you know you want to see more of these, like in your subscriber feed. And if you don't, you'll also be going with Gandalf, so think about it. So, as I kind of mentioned in last week's video, Isildur definitely did do the wrong thing in keeping the ring, as we all know. I mean, why would he have done that? However, he was very well known for doing something else before that, where he did kind of have a bit of a tussle with Sauron on Numenor, and he won that time also. Because the White Tree of Gondor is not from Gondor, even if it is in Gondor now. Because everything in this universe has a very long and illustrious ancestry, and it is no different for this particular tree. So tens of thousands years prior, we had the two trees of the world that gave off all the light that you would see. This was before the sun and the moon, and they were Telperion and Laurelin. This video isn't about the two trees, but essentially one was like the moon, it gave off silver light, and the other was like the sun, that was Laurelin, and that would give off kind of like sunlight or golden light. However, Morgoth would destroy the trees. Yavanna, who was like the Valar of shrubberies and wildlife and, well, trees and that mainly. Anyway, she made a tree in the likeness of Telperion. That was the silver moon-like tree. The elves really liked the trees, and they were sad that they were gone. So she made Galathilion, and this was set up, or planted rather. It was planted in Tirion, which was the Noldorin chief city upon the hill of Tuna. Tirion upon Tuna. And then for those sailor elves that kind of felt a little bit left out, they also got a tree, and they basically used a sapling then from Galathilion and planted it upon Tol Eressëa, the Lonely Isle, and that was named Celeborn. By the way, this Celeborn is not the same as the Celeborn that would be Galadriel's husband. And so it remained that the only white trees that were around were over in Valinor, but at the end of the first age and at the beginning of the second age, then you had Numenor, and kind of to signal the new friendship or the renewed friendship between the two kindreds of men and elves, they decided to give the Numenorians their own white tree, and that was named Nimloth. And Nimloth was sired, or a sapling, then of Celeborn from the Isle of Tol Eressëa. And this was one of the many things that the elves that would come from Tol Eressëa, they'd come and sail to Numenor, and they'd have a real good time. Of course, other things that they brought along would be like the Tar-Palantir, the seeing stones and whatnot. So these were good times, and during the good times, things were good. But things would not be good for all that long. I mean, I say for all that long, it would go... Things were quite good for hundreds, if not thousands of years, really. But it got to a certain point when the Numenorians look at the elves and they see how they're immortal, they do not die. Why do we have to? Like, we're so great, we're so cool, why do we have to succumb to death like just ordinary men of Middle-earth? And I am just going to breeze past much of the rebellion against the Valar, but it did kind of become a thing within the psyche of many of the Numenorians before even Sauron turned up there. And they were very resentful of the fact that they had to die, and they did not see it as the gift that it was intended as by Eru Ilúvatar. But of course Sauron did arrive, because that is what happened when Ar-Pharazôn, the final king of Numenor, he would then go and capture him and bring him back. And Sauron really stirred the pot a lot, and as we all know. So that really escalated things very quickly up until the point that they would sail west, and they would fail, of course. But I think talking about this history is very important because you need to know the context for which all of these things are happening. So without adding this in, it would feel potentially very disjointed of why I think the tree is very important. So when this rebellion against the Valar and the West was occurring in Numenor, of course not everyone was fully on board with that. You had some that were named the King's Men, and they were obviously those siding with the king, and they were against the West. Then you had the Faithful, and the Faithful, as the name suggests, they kept faith with the Valar and had close friendship still with the elves. And because of this, the vast majority that were of the King's Men, they persecuted those that were of the Faithful. If you were one of the Faithful, these were really dangerous times, because of course there was actually human sacrifice going on in Numenor as they were trying to appease Melkor, or Morgoth, Sauron's former boss. And as we know, some of the Faithful, or the leaders of the Faithful, were the Lords of Andúnie, and those were Amandil and his son Elendil the Tall, and I suppose at this point he was just Elendil. Yeah. And then you had his sons Isildur and Anarion, and we all know who they are, right? So you had these dangerous times where you've got then Sauron whispering into the king's ears saying, like, we need to chop down that tree because that's something that was given by the elves, and before that it was like by the Valar made, and so we need to get rid of that because that's a symbol of the rebellion. We can't be having that here. We need to chop it up and burn it on a pyre. And this is when Isildur's heroics come into it. And his grandfather Amandil, he heard of this Sauron's will, essentially, to burn Nimloth. And Isildur then obviously was told about this also, and he went of his own volition. He didn't tell anyone. He went by the cover of night and a disguise. He went into the courts of the king in Armenelos, which, by the way, was completely forbidden if you were one of the Faithful. So even at that point, he's already breaking the law. He could get, sacrificed. But he went even further than that. He went in to the place of the tree, wherever the tree was planted, further in within the court of the king. And this was barred for everyone. This wasn't even those of the king's men. They weren't allowed in there. This would be like certain death if you were found here. And it was guarded day and night by servants of Sauron. He went in there and he got a seedling, or a fruit rather, from Nimloth. And at this point, this was in the autumn, so it didn't have loads of trees, loads of flowers and whatnot. And then the guards noticed him, and there was a big kerfuffle, bit of a fight. He got heavily wounded, but he made it back to Amandil, his grandfather. He had not been, they didn't recognise him, they didn't know who he was, and he made it out alive. He got severely wounded, and because of this is why he won so much renown within the Faithful. And as autumn turned to winter, winter into spring, the sapling, or the fruit rather, I keep calling it, the fruit bore a sapling, and it sprouted out some life. And with that, Isildur recovered from his wounds, and all was jolly in the lands of the Faithful, although not really, because they're still getting persecuted. And that in itself is very important, because the penultimate king of Numenor, and the one that was just previous to Ar-Pharazôn, was Tar-Palantir, and he was far-sighted, as his name suggests, and he prophesied that the line of the kings was directly tied to the fate of the tree. And it was actually for this reason that Ar-Pharazôn did not particularly want to chop down the tree, but alas he did, because the night after Isildur actually made it out of there with the fruit, that is when he finally succumbed to Sauron's wishes and it was chopped down and burned. So, but if we just think back to the prophecy of Tar-Palantir, does that mean that Ar-Pharazôn effectively sealed his fate by burning it down? It's quite an interesting thought, because of course he would then sail into the west onto Tol Eressëa, and he would be buried alive by Eru Ilúvatar, therefore going on to Valinor. They weren't allowed to do that. And then, by Isildur being healed, kind of, by the time when the fruit became a sapling, does that mean then, well, I mean, I feel like it's quite obvious, really, because he did then become the king, but by the fruit becoming a sapling and growing into a new tree, the line of kings was renewed. And it's at that point, the kingship kind of effectively kind of left Ar-Pharazôn, who, by the way, wasn't a legitimate king anyway, and then went to the line of Amandil. Now, Elendil then would have this on his standard, on his banner, and all the rest of his livery, the white tree. And that is also a symbol of hope. It's kind of a rallying symbol for all the Dunedain in exile. Like, this is what we are fighting for. We're fighting for the West, for our friendship with the elves as well, like solidarity and all that. We're not at all related, we're not at all affiliated with Sauron. He's the bad guy, we're fighting him. And so it was that as Isildur had risked his neck, very literally, to get the fruit of Nimloth, it was he that was then allowed to keep hold of the sapling, and when he came to Middle-earth, he would plant it in front of his house in Minas Ithil, his city, the Tower of the Moon. Although, once again, this wouldn't last, because the fall of Numenor was in 3319 of the Second Age, and Minas Ithil would then fall in 3429 of the Second Age, and the tree there would get burned again by the forces of Sauron, who had returned. So he actually managed to get another sapling as he then sailed down the Anduin and escaped. And, you know, you had the War of the Last Alliance at that point. But once that was all over, the second year of the Third Age, Isildur would then plant the sapling at the court in Minas Anor in memory of his brother Anarion, who would then die during the Siege of Barad-dûr. And that was the White Tree of Gondor, and that is where it would remain. However, not quite, because that tree did actually die again in 1636 of the Third Age. This is when the Great Plague came out of the east and decimated Gondor, killed like half the population. Absolute scenes there. And again, you see the wavering of the king's line, because of the king at the time did die. So with the death of the king, you have the death of the tree, kind of showing just that prophecy of Tar-Palantir bearing some fruit at least. There'd be a new tree though in 1640 and a new king, but then that tree also would die, unfortunately. I just have to check here. It was 2872, which is quite an odd year really, but that was when the steward Belecthor died. Yeah, this was 802 years after the end of the line of kings down in the Southern Kingdom. So that's quite interesting, really. Why did it die at that point rather than when the line of kings failed? Is that because there was still some hope at that point? Because you did still have the chieftains of the Dunedain up in the north. Well, and you had the heirs of Isildur always alive there. And then it just died, completely unrelated probably to the steward Belecthor, even though I'm sure he was a good man, but he was no king. So at that point, was there just a certain point of lost hope, perhaps? And then, of course, you had Aragorn. He would become the king of both Gondor and Arnor in 3019 of the Third Age. And Aragorn found then another sapling, because they're just everywhere. Up above Minas Tirith on the mountain that kind of is right behind it, Mount Mindolluin. And up there then he found the sapling and he brought it back down to Minas Tirith and planted it in the same spot where the dead tree was. But the dead tree, that was taken to Arath Din in the Silent Street, where you have all the tombs of the former kings and all that stuff. But if we just look back at the prophecy of Tar-Palantir, where you have, the line of the kings is so closely tied with this tree. When you see that it has grown then again, that is like the renewal of the line of kings, obviously. So Aragorn was undoubtedly the true king, and no one could refute that. And that really is one of the most overlooked parts and real acknowledgements to the fact that Aragorn was like this blast from the past and most alike to Elendil in the thousands of years between them. But none of this could have been possible without Isildur's heroics. To have done what he did, he gets a bad rap for everything regarding the ring, but he really did show some of the good stuff here. And how fitting then that it is of the line of Isildur, Aragorn, you get him to get another sapling in such heroic circumstances with the War of the Ring. And then thanks to these bros, you've got this tree which is kind of descended from the Valar. It's got some of the design of the Elder Days and the elves as well in there, and it's just a really nice symbol of former glory and what could be in the future as well. It's not just like, oh, we used to be great, like, oh, look at that. It's still really hopeful for the future, and I think that is why the tree is so important as well. And it's just great that Isildur was able to save it. So let's not just, don't hate Isildur. He was a good guy too. Next week then, I'm thinking, rather than, we're not just going to talk about Isildur all the time, and we're not going to talk about Aragorn necessarily either. How about we talk about Arwen, and why did she not sail west after Aragorn died? Given the fact that she was an elf. Right then, well, I hope that you've enjoyed watching this. I hope that it hasn't been overly boring. Right, just like and subscribe. And comment. I do like the comments. The comments are fantastic. But for now then, I am going with Gandalf. Good day. Oh, and also the white trees didn't give off light like this. It was only Telperion that did that. Spooky, spooky.